Welcome to lecture Abnormal Psych. This one about causes of abnormal behavior. Now you'll notice causes is in quotation marks there, and that's very much on purpose. And as we'll see when we talk about the etiology, the things that contribute to the development of abnormal behavior, it's not really clear that we have a solid understanding of what makes that happen, what the cause is. So these are more like ideas of what might contribute to the origins of abnormal behavior. Okay. That being said, quick overview. We'll talk about some competing perspectives across time about the etiology of abnormal behavior in psychopathology. We'll talk about the approach that kind of dominates the field now, which is an integrative approach. And we'll talk about what's being integrated, and that's primarily ideas about biological influences, ideas about psychosocial influences, and then ideas about developmental influences. Okay, looking at the evolution of, and eventually there came the biological paradigm with obviously some of the thinking there being very old, some being a little newer, when it really taking on steam in terms of, okay, well, we're pretty sure that these things that we're calling psychopathology are caused by some biological entity. Largely has to do with the discovery of general paresis related to syphilis, that they identified, okay, here's this disease that the late stage of syphilis causes these psychological symptoms, and they then thought, okay, all other psychological symptoms that we see eventually will find the disease they're linked to, and the pathogen, some sort of bacterial infection, viral infection that they're linked to, and then you had the discovery of the psychotropic medications that were thought to be miracle drugs when they were first discovered, and it turned out not to be so great. But again, these pieces of evidence suggesting, okay, it definitely is something maybe biological. And then more recently, with advances in genetics and neuroscience, that perspective is still with us. But it wasn't the only one, right? You also had the psychodynamic perspective being born in the 1900s with Freud, and then later his followers, the Neo-Freudians. And then we had the behavioral paradigm come through. It said, okay, no, that held sway for a while. You had the humanistic perspective, which was largely reaction to optimistic. Then the cognitive perspective, which really got a full head of steam with the discovery of computing technology, right? Because you had this metaphor of and then you have one of the more recent perspectives being cognitive behavioral, so combining the ideas of cognitive science with behavioral science, looking how thoughts influence behaviors, including emotions, and also how those behaviors, emotions, feed back onto thoughts and how that all works together in this interactive way. And the interaction between those things kind of foreshadows where we're going overall with our ideas about abnormal behavior. But for a long time, for the large part of the 1900s, the 20th century, these different ideas were competing, right? And it was not, hey, I think this and you think that. That's interesting. Maybe we're both right. It was very much those idiots. What are they thinking? That's not what caused abnormal behavior. This is. And proponents of one viewpoint would often disparage proponents of another, and it became like people were warring for who was going to be right. So, moving to where we are now. Looking at whether a unidimensional model, like psychodynamic, would be one dimension. Okay, it's this stuff that's going on. Or biological would be one dimension. No, it's this stuff. Or humanistic. No, it's this stuff. So, is it one of these things versus maybe it's not? Maybe it's a multi-dimensional model would make better sense. And one thing I think that helps us think about this is actually an old legend that John Godfrey Sachs wrote a poem version of, which I'll share with you here. It was 6 men of Indostan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl. God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall. The second feeling of the tusk cried, Ho, what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to me 'tis mighty clear. This wonder of an elephant is very like a spear. The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up and spake, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a snake. The fourth reached out an eager hand, and fell about the knee. What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain, quoth he. 'Tis clear enough, the elephant is very like a tree. The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, E'en the blindest man can tell what this resembleth most. Deny the fact who can, this marvel of an elephant is very like a fan. The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a rope. And so these men of Indostan disputed long and loud, each in his own opinion exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. So oft in theologic wars the disputants, I ween, rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant not one of them has seen. So thinking here about this applied to these perspectives that were kind of warring in the 1900s, each one saying, no, I've looked at this part and clearly this is what psychopathology is and what causes it. I've got the answer. And each of them were right to some degree. But to the extent that they ignored the influences other people were pointing to, they were also wrong. They lacked this kind of full picture. And so that's what we're hoping to move toward now with this kind of multidimensional integrative approach. Okay, so there's no winner from the early versions competing who's right and who's wrong, and even the argument kind of boiled down more recently to you could argue nature versus nurture, which one causes abnormal behavior. And again, it's not a stupid question. It's not which one. It's how do they both do it, right? What's the integration? There's not a winner there. So when you're thinking about how to integrate these things, how to think of things from a multi-dimensional perspective, there's a couple things to consider. One being this idea of holism. Also important when thinking about causality, some ideas related to, as we'll talk about toward the end, about the developmental approach, equifinality and multifinality. So equifinality is the another idea in here is the diathesis-stress model. So this idea, diathesis, is kind of this a weakness or vulnerability. And so the idea being that people have some weakness or vulnerability possibly for abnormal behavior, for psychopathology. And that diathesis, that vulnerability, could be one that is biological, right? So there may be some genetic predisposition. Maybe they have a structural difference in their brain. Okay, their brain is built a little differently, and so, okay, they have this vulnerability. Doesn't mean they're necessarily going to exhibit psychopathology, exhibit abnormal behavior. The Diathesis-stress model says some people are going to have more vulnerability than others, but whether or not they actually show, develop, exhibit abnormal behavior depends on what happens to them if there's some stress, right? And again, that stress could be biological stress, could be psychosocial stress, right? But so you're vulnerable, but it's not going to show up unless something happens. And the something usually is something that usually something negative, like a loss, actual stress, anxiety, fear, trauma, those types of things. Again, the diathesis could also be, doesn't have to be biological. The vulnerability could be psychosocial, right? So if you're born into an impoverished environment, you could argue that's a diathesis. Okay, now you're at a greater vulnerability for developing some types of psychopathology, but it depends on what happens to you next. Depends on the stress you experience and the resources you experience on the flip side of that. Okay. In all this, it's important to keep in mind this idea of developmental psychopathology. And that's the idea that psychopathology isn't a yes, no, right? Diagnosis is a yes, no. You make a decision, you meet criteria, you don't meet criteria. But psychopathology is something that develops over time. You begin to show typically more and more symptoms until you reach a threshold where a diagnosis can be assigned. But it's not static, right? Even once you have a diagnosis, that person isn't the same today that they're going to be tomorrow. They're always changing, and not just your normal behavior is changing, abnormal behavior changes as well. So it's important to keep in mind that all the things we're talking about, these influences, they're changing over time, and there are some important developmental components to this, which again we'll circle back to at the end. Okay, in terms of the big influences, talk about biological influences. One of the biggest in there is genetics. So when we talk about genetics, talk about genes, what are we talking about? You know, say, oh well, yeah, I've got the genes for that. What does that mean? So genes are their DNA, right? DNA, and well, what is it that these things do? Right? You say, oh yeah, it's genetic. The genes did that. Well, how did the genes do that? Like, did that gene make you do this thing? No, not exactly. At least not directly, because what genes do is they code for proteins, right? They're blueprints, and they're blueprints for proteins. Like you say, oh, well, you have the hair color. My hair color is because of genes. Yes, but it's a few steps back from that, right? Because you have genes that code for these proteins, and these proteins then form into these other things, which eventually will lead to cells, which will then maybe have a different one color or the other, right? So the gene doesn't make the thing directly. It's not gene to hair color, to eye color, to intelligence. It's just genes to proteins, and the proteins are building blocks for all the things in your body, including your brain, your skin, your bones, your blood, all that stuff. It's created based on the instructions in the genes, which are, again, just making proteins, which are then combined in interesting ways. One of the cool things about them, though, is that it's not just a matter of, okay, here's the blueprints, and when you're born, okay, here's your initial build, and then you're just growing from the initial build, right? No, there are these epigenetic effects, right? So after you're first conceived and you're developing, your genes aren't done, right? Over time, genes can change. They can be turned on and turned off. And what do you mean by turned on, turned off? Well, again, genes code for proteins, and sometimes they'll be making proteins. Sometimes they won't be. What makes them make them? What makes them not make them? Well, that's that getting turned on, getting turned off, and it happens at a molecular level where sometimes it's a gene will create a protein to send a message over here to tell this gene to turn on to now make its protein, or to turn off to say stop making those proteins. Or it could be an environmental stimulus that causes a gene to turn on or turn off, right? If you get more light, more temperature, less temperature, these things can have an impact, changing the structure and the arrangement of these molecules that can, again, turn the machine on, turn the machine off to start coding or stop coding for these different proteins, which is pretty cool. So when people say things are genetic, it's like, yeah, but your environment can influence your genetics. So yeah, it's all bound up. It is very much this interaction, right? One of the other cool things is most everything that's interesting about you isn't determined by single gene inheritance. It's by polygenic inheritance, right? There's multiple genes influencing a particular trait, right? And the broader we get with our conceptualization of a trait, the more genes are likely involved, right? If you talk about, okay, intelligence is highly heritable, right? It's influenced by genetics. Yeah, that's certainly true. But you're never going to find, okay, well, what is the IQ? What's the smart gene? Oh, is it this one? This one? Oh, is it these three? These four? These 1,000? Probably thousands, right? Because intelligence is such a complex construct. Now, if you start focusing in, and this is again going back to that reductionistic thinking for a bit, which is sometimes helpful. If we say, okay, what genes are involved in people's the speed at which people can process information when doing a coding task, right? When they're sorting, is this a square or a triangle? Okay, right. Probably fewer genes involved in that than they're involved in determining your intelligence, right? But we still, it's unlikely that we're going to really isolate in a meaningful way, in my lifetime anyway. Okay, these are the genes for this behavioral construct, you know, be it intelligence, shyness, curiosity, whatever. These things are just too complicated and influenced by too many genes to identify, okay, these are the ones that are going to affect that. At least that's my take on it. We talked about the Diathesis-stress model earlier, and often that's talked about in terms of genetic vulnerability. Specifically relating it back to abnormal behavior, when we talk about genetic vulnerability in the heritability of psychopathology, the diagnosis that has the most evidence for genetic component and the highest heritable rate would be schizophrenia, right? So if you've got somebody, a pair of twins, identical twins, right, where they share 99.99% of their DNA, and again, identical twins usually not 100% identical because science, but almost completely identical. One of them has schizophrenia. The odds of the other one having schizophrenia, they have almost exactly the same genes. It's less than 50%. It's close to 50%, but it's still less than 50%, a coin flip. But I thought it was highly genetic. It is, but it's clearly not all genetic. And most other disorders have much lower heritability rates. The next highest one would probably be bipolar disorder, especially when there's mania. But then it drops and drops and drops lower and lower for the other ones. Maybe because of polygenic inheritance, maybe because we still don't have a good idea of who has a disorder and who doesn't, because their criteria are a little messy, which we'll talk about in future chapters. Okay, moving on to neuroscience. So thinking about the nervous system, right? You've got the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and spinal cord, right? Brain arguably being the more important component of that, but spinal cord does its thing too, right? It carries messages, and there may be actually some learning that goes on in the spinal cord, which is really fascinating. You've got a peripheral nervous system, right, made up of the somatic and autonomic. The somatic controlling your muscles and all that stuff. The autonomic being a bit more interesting for us in terms of abnormal behavior. It's the one that controls all your regulatory functions, breathing, heart rate, digestion, those kind of things. And it's interesting because it's again broken down into two subsystems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Right? And these we'll talk a lot about when we talk about anxiety disorders, right? Because the sympathetic system, that's the one that whenever you have some stimulus in your environment that is dangerous, your sympathetic nervous system goes, danger, let's get jacked, fight or flight, right? So heart rate goes up, respiration increases, the digestion stops. Okay, I'm not going to poop or pee myself right now. No time to digest my food. Got to run from this bear, right? And again, that's super helpful when you're running from a bear. Whenever you're trying to give a presentation in class, not as helpful, right? Your mouth gets all dry and your heart's racing. That's not that adaptive, right? But was adaptive elsewhere. But anyway, it's involved in this fear response, and it's adaptive in some situations. But you can't have that heart rate jacked up for too long, right? It'd be too much stress in the system, cause heart disease. So you've got this built-in countermeasure, the parasympathetic nervous system, that will come in, shut things down, slow the heart rate back down, which is awesome. That's a great thing to have. And it's going to be really helpful, as we'll see when we talk about anxiety disorders, you can talk with clients about, okay, yeah, whenever you have these anxious things, that's your sympathetic nervous system don't worry, your parasympathetic is going to shut it down. It's going to be unpleasant for you until it does, but believe me, it will shut it down. You can't keep going. You can't stay in this panic mode. Your body will bring it down. Just hang in there. Right? And again, as I said before, the brain, fascinating organ. I won't go into too much detail because there's a whole lot we could go into. But breaking it down roughly, right? We've got the hindbrain, and again, literally thinking about in the back of your head, going from the neck up. You've got your medulla oblongata, cerebellum, your basic life functions being controlled here, some motor coordination. But really, this is that kind of reptilian brain that's not doing a lot of thinking, just breathe, heartbeat. There's a vomit center in there, which is interesting, which makes sense. Think about, when you're eating, if you eat some bad berries, you want the very primal part of your brain to know those are bad berries and throw them up before it gets any further in your system. Then you go further up into the brain, you get the midbrain, which you have your thalamus and hypothalamus. And that's mostly a relay station, right? So there's information coming up from about the basic functions like, oh, hey, I can't breathe, or the heart's beating really fast, relaying up to the forebrain, and also messages coming back down from the forebrain saying, hey, relax, everything's fine, there's no bear, heart rate, you can slow down. That message is going to come from the forebrain through the midbrain and go back down. So information is being processed here. So some of it is just being passed on, but there's some also condensing of information because you're getting all kinds of different sensory inputs, cognitive inputs, you got your memory inputs. All these things have to be put together in a way that and routed to where they need to go for you to take action. And that's largely what the midbrain does. The forebrain, this is the most interesting part of the brain. This is where you're doing the thinking, the feeling, and again, the upper level coordination of inputs, the kind of weighing, okay, well, should I do this or should I do that? That's the forebrain stuff, right? You've got your limbic system here, which has your amygdala and hippocampus, but then you also have your cerebral cortex, right, with your 4 different lobes, which the frontmost part of the lobe is the frontal lobe, and the frontmost part of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal lobe, and the prefrontal lobe, think about at the back and base of your head is kind of most base reptilian primordial organism, and then going forward up to the front is the most advanced, right? That's what separates us from the lower animals, is that kind of forebrain functioning, and that's where you're doing your thinking, you're analyzing your abstract thinking. And it's something we'll talk a lot about with abnormal behavior, is the idea of the possibility of top-down control. Whenever you're getting some misfiring messages from hindbrain or maybe even from midbrain, oh, you should be scared. If you can engage that prefrontal cortex to go, you know what, I've thought about it, and yes, I realize my heart is beating very fast now, but there's no reason for it. You can calm down now, heart, right? And having that kind of super logical Spock-like messages going from the forebrain back down can change the way the body is functioning. And that's a lot of what's done with kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, which we'll touch on throughout the semester. Okay, looking still at neuroscience, talking about neurons, right? Which neurons are just the brain cells. And there's different types of neurons in the brain, but generally they have a cell body, right, which is the soma, that's where the nucleus is and all that stuff. They've got dendrites, which are these kind of usually tree-shaped things extending out from the cell body, from the soma. They're kind of reaching out for information, if you will, kind of imagine that. They're the things that bring information into the cell. And once they come into the cell, then information goes down the axon, so it's this kind of long tube, well, some longer than others. Axon information is carried down there, and then at the end of the axon, there's these terminal boutons that have, they're filled with neurotransmitters, right? So information is coming into the dendrite, activating at the soma, sending a message down the axon, and then once it gets to the axon, all the way to the end of the axon, to the terminal boutons, they release these neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about neuronal transmission in just a minute. So that's the basic structure of a neuron. And in the brain, these neurons often are grouped in such a way that they create these neural pathways or circuits, these kind of brain pathways, brain circuits, where you have, okay, there's this neuron where information is coming in, it's activated, and it's going to send a message to the next neuron. That neuron is going to catch the message with its dendrites, send it on down the axon to the terminal boutons, send it on. So it's this chain of one to the next, to the next, to the next, right? And often that chain will use the same type of neurotransmitter. It'll be kind of like if it all uses serotonin, it's called a serotonergic pathway. Right? So there's these circuits all throughout the brain. But when you think about these circuits, you can't think too much like a computer or wiring unless you think about, okay, well, there's all these wires in here and messages sent along the wires, but all throughout the brain, the insulation on those wires is scraped away in places, right? And you've got bare wire touching bare wire, which in some ways is adaptive, some ways maladaptive, right? Because information is going along the circuit, right? If there's this other adjacent circuit that is also active at the same time, that might interfere with the message being sent on the first circuit. It also might enhance the message, right? It might be, okay, here's this fear message coming in from the vision input. Okay, well, we're also going to have some smell input saying, yeah, it smells scary too, and I hear this thing, that's coming in too, and those things are touching on that same circuit and feeding into it to amplify the signal. Well, that's adaptive. So sometimes it's good, sometimes not so good. But keep in mind that the brain isn't this kind of closed system that's very neat. It's fairly messy, and all these circuits are squished in together where things are touching each other, and activity in one area can bleed over and affect activity in another area. So these circuits aren't fully insulated or separated. Another thing to think about is when we talk about these structures in the brain, a lot of times the structures talk about we've given names to. Sometimes they get lazy and just call them a type of ganglia. Oh, the basal ganglia, the caudate nucleus. Ganglia is not really a thing. It's a bunch of cells that are clustered together and seem to function together somehow. So these structures in the brain aren't structures in the same way that your nose is a structure or your ears. Right? It's hard to point out, okay, here it is. It's like, here's where we think this thing is in the brain. It's a little amorphous, a little mushy, if you will. They're just largely clusters of cells that tend to work together for a purpose. That's how the brain is organized. So how the information is spread? Well, that's the thing we've already kind of alluded to, this idea of neuronal transmission, which is an electrochemical process, right? Where you've got the dendrites reaching out, and whenever between two neurons, you've got the dendrites of one neuron reaching out toward the terminal boutons of another neuron, typically. And in the space in between is the synapse, right? And when you say one neuron is talking or interacting with another one, you say it synapses onto that. And often the synapse occurs at the junction between the dendrites and the terminal boutons. It doesn't always do that. Sometimes there can be a synapse between the dendrites and the axon, between the dendrites and the cell body. So not always the same way, but the kind of classical way to think about it is between dendrites and the terminal boutons. So in that space between, there's this synapse, right? So at some point, there's neurotransmitters that are diffusing, floating across the synapse, and they're attaching to the dendrites. And when they do, quite frequently, they're causing ion channels to open or close in the cell membranes on that postsynaptic cell in the dendrites. And when those ions open or close, it changes the polarity of the cell membrane, right? If you have positive ions coming in, it gets more positive. If you have negative ions coming in, it gets more negative, right? And so what happens is, if you get sufficient ionic shift to depolarize a cell, right? And it has to have enough. If it's not enough, nothing happens. But if enough happens, boom, a switch gets flipped, and now this electric current is generated from these ions all coming in. And again, they're going to be pumped back out pretty soon. But enough of them come in, this current is generated, and that current shoots down the axon, and it gets down to the end of the axon. Then it's going to cause the terminal boutons to release, you guessed it, more neurotransmitters, and now they're going to diffuse across the synapse and attach to the next postsynaptic cell, and it's going to then depolarize and fire, right? Or, interesting, they can also have the opposite effect. They can hyperpolarize, which is kind of cool. So there's these chemicals going across, causing this electrical current, all happening over and over again, and happening super fast, milliseconds, right? So when this is happening, these neurotransmitters that are going across can have different effects. They can have agonistic effects or antagonistic effects, right? So they can be agonists or antagonists. Agonists typically means they're making the next thing do its thing, making the cell fire, right? Causing the release of more of the next neurotransmitter. Antagonist is more of like, no, it's going to stop it, right? Okay, this cell keeps firing. Okay, then this thing's going to come in and it's going to tell it to, hey, stop, slow down, stop firing. That would be an antagonistic effect. Another concept with neurotransmission I need to make sure I mention, when those neurotransmitters diffuse across the synapse, right, and they attach to the postsynaptic cell, they don't stay there. They don't get stuck in there. They stick in there for a minute, cause ion channels to open, and then they kind of float back into the synapse, and they're taken back, typically, into the original cell that released them. Sometimes they're taken back whole, and sometimes they're taken back, they're broken down by enzymes, and then the pieces are taken back, and those pieces are reassembled so they can be used again, right? So you have this process of reuptake, which will be important when we talk about psychopharmacology later, because you can block the reuptake so those things stay in the synapse longer and make the postsynaptic cell keep firing. Okay, so when we talk about these neurotransmitters, what are we talking about? Well, the main ones we'll talk about are acetylcholine, glutamate, GABA, 5-HT, which is 5-hydroxytryptamine. You probably know it as serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So acetylcholine. Okay. So what about this idea of a chemical imbalance? Well, that's the cause of abnormal behavior. That held sway for a long time, but more recently, we've kind of moved past that. It's a lot more complicated than that. It's not that you have too much serotonin or too little serotonin or too much GABA. When people have severe psychopathology, we can often identify that they have abnormal levels of serotonergic activity or noradrenergic activity. But the evidence that, okay, just too much of this caused this, and changing the amount of neurotransmitters you have will fix things, not so much. It seems to be much more complicated than that. And sometimes the changes in levels of neurotransmitters, rather than being causes of abnormal behavior, might be the result of abnormal behavior, right? Abnormal behavior causes this change in environmental inputs, and then changes those environmental inputs will then lead to changes in the neurotransmitters, either the amount of neurotransmitters or the sensitivity of the neurons that are reacting to those neurotransmitters, right? They can become hypersensitive or insensitive to those neurotransmitters, right? Via processes of desensitization or upregulation or downregulation. But the main thing with neurotransmission is it's complicated, and it's not a simple chemical imbalance. Okay, moving on to psychosocial influences, looking at the behavioral and cognitive sciences. Going back a ways, classical conditioning, right? Pavlov, studying with the dogs, with the salivating. Everybody remembers that story. So identified if you have an unconditioned stimulus that leads to an unconditioned response, right? So you present meat powder to a dog, dog salivates. Didn't have to learn that. That's a natural thing beyond the dog's control. It just happens. Now, if you repeatedly pair that unconditioned, it should be US, unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus, so you pair the meat powder repeatedly with a bell, you'll still get that unconditioned response. Do that enough, though, eventually that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and so now you can present the bell, and now it's a conditioned stimulus, and it elicits a conditioned response, right? It will elicit the salivation. Now, what's that have to do with abnormal behavior? A lot of things, but one of the things that's probably easiest to think about would be one theory about how phobias may be acquired, right? Where somebody is having a fear response to a fearful situation, right? They're attacked by a big scary dog when they're a little kid, and the dog's barking and real loud, and I'm scared, and my heart's beating. And so that's an unconditioned stimulus leading to an unconditioned response. But associated with that scary dog, it might generalize to all dogs, not scary dogs, or other animals that look somewhat like a dog. And so now the person, they see a horse and they freak out and they have this phobia of all animals, all four-footed animals. Well, that arguably was brought about via classical conditioning. And if so, well, that tells us some very interesting things about how we can treat it. And as I already alluded to, classical conditioning typically involves involuntary behavior, or there's this unconditioned response that you can start to elicit via something that wouldn't normally elicit just by repeatedly pairing these two things. Now, maybe more relevant to abnormal behavior would be the ideas of operant conditioning, which were explored extensively by B.F. Skinner. Right? So this is where you have some stimulus and then an operant response that will then lead to a consequence. And the nature of the consequence determines the probability of repeating the operant response. Right? So you tell your kid, hey, clean up your room. And now they've got a choice, right? Because this has to do with voluntary behavior. They clean up the room. Okay, cool. And then you say, okay, great, thanks for cleaning up your room. Now you can go play Xbox. You give them a reward. Okay, they like the reward. They're associating that reward with the operant response of cleaning up the room when the stimulus of you telling them to was present. Now, next time you tell them to clean up the room, they're more likely to clean it up, right? Because that reward makes things more likely to happen, right? Positive reinforcement. You say, hey, clean up your room, and they say, no, not gonna do it. And you say, okay, well, I'm gonna take away the Xbox now. Okay, so now I've just given you a punishment for saying no, so I'm now making it less likely you're going to say no. I'm decreasing the likelihood of your refusal. And then we can go on about negative reinforcement, negative punishment, but another time. Oh, sorry. What does that have to do with abnormal behavior? Again, going back to phobias and even with things like PTSD, you can talk about operant conditioning being at play, where somebody encounters a stimulus that causes a fear response. I start to feel bad. Okay, when I feel bad, now I can make an operant response. The feeling bad is the stimulus. I can stick with what I'm doing, right? So I'm at the fireworks show and it's going off loud, pop, 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 and I'm starting to feel bad. I can stay there and watch the fireworks and feel bad, or I can leave. Okay. Now, if I leave, I'll feel better. When I feel better, the aversive stimulus of feeling bad has gone away. Okay. If I take away something bad by doing a behavior, again, I'm more likely to do the behavior. If I'm more likely to do the behavior, and the behavior being go away, I've reinforced the going away. I've reinforced avoidance of the fear stimulus. Now, when I reinforce avoidance, the other thing that does is it keeps me afraid, right? Because if I stayed with the fireworks and it was unpleasant, one thing we know because of classical conditioning and extinction is if I stay long enough, eventually, if I don't get hit by a firework and actually don't get hurt, I'll stop feeling bad, right? Because I'm feeling bad because it's reminding me of when people were shooting at me and blowing things up, right? And I was in danger. But again, if you repeatedly expose someone to this conditioned stimulus in the absence of the real stimulus, eventually the connection breaks. You have extinction, and you'll no longer feel bad. But that connection can't break if you avoid. So we'll talk a lot about operant conditioning. We'll talk about fears, phobias, and also PTSD type stuff. Another idea kind of related to all this would be learned helplessness, what Seligman researched, right, where you had the animal, usually a dog, on this in this lab, on this platform, where at first, you know, the dog's on this grid that's you know, got electrical current running through it, and they'll start zapping the dog, but then the dog can move and get off the grid and no longer be zapped. Ah, dog, man, that sucked. I didn't like being zapped, but the dog's fine. Dog's still happy. Whew, that was fine. Now you teach the dog that, oh, just move and you'll be fine. Just move and you'll be fine. And then you do kind of a shitty thing. You electrify the whole room. Dog moves, still gets shocked. Ah, what the hell? Move some more, still get shocked. Move some more, still get shocked. Eventually, the dog learns, well, crap, no matter what I do, I'm going to get shocked. And the dog develops a little doggy depression. Right? And those experiments with those animals, Seligman used to generalize towards people, with the idea being that when we think things are out of our control, and it really does have to do with what we think, our attributions, the explanations we make. When we think that we have no control over consequences, particularly negative consequences, that tends to lead to kind of pathological emotional experiences. It leads to depression. Right? So there's some the kind of cognitive input there. But on the flip side, Seligman more recently is also looking at the idea of learned optimism. These people that have somehow managed to, no matter what, when something goes bad, they make these attributions of, oh, but it's going to be okay. And the people that are able to do that tend to be healthier, both psychologically and physically. They tend to live longer. So now it's a matter of figuring out, okay, well, how do they get to be that way, right? Which is that kind of flipping the question of, well, how did you get to be abnormal? Well, how did you get to be abnormal in this kind of positive way, which is kind of what positive psychology is a lot about. Okay. You also have the social learning from Albert Bandura, talking a lot about modeling, right, where we learn by watching other people, right? So again, think about things like with anxiety disorders. If you've got a parent who's chronically afraid of mice, screams when they see mice, you're probably going to think, oh shit, mice are pretty scary. I better be scared of them too. And like, you've never had a bad experience with a mouse, but now you're afraid of them because you've seen somebody else be afraid of them. Right? And we can even pull back from the classical and operant conditioning stuff and apply it to social learning with the idea of vicarious reinforcement, right? Where we see somebody else experiencing a consequence and we learn from their experience, right? We see them get rewarded for doing something, and now we're more likely to do it. Or we see them get punished for doing something, and now we're less likely to do the thing they got punished for because we don't want it to happen to us. So all those principles of reinforcement and punishment can also be at play if we see those consequences, those associations happening to people that are close to us. And again, there's a couple more, it's a little more complex than that in terms of, well, it's not just anybody you see. It has to be certain types of people, certain types of relationships. But certainly some interesting ideas there. What about the unconscious, right? Which Freud made famous or infamous. And when we talk about it now, we often don't talk about it from a Freudian sense so much. But there's no doubt that there are processes that influence our behavior that go on beyond everyday conscious awareness, right? One of the big pieces of evidence for this is the documentation of implicit memory, right? There are things that you know that you don't know you know, right? Where we can show via these kind of learning paradigms that, okay, yeah, you have been exposed to this word before, you did see this picture, you don't remember seeing it, but the way you answer this question, you wouldn't have answered it that way if you hadn't heard that word, if you hadn't seen that question, right? So if that's the case, then there are probably some memories of maybe not so pleasant things in our lives for some of us that are having an effect on us, right? And even if we can't remember it, or it's just not active in our memory right now, doesn't mean it's not influencing us, because there is evidence that it's still there. Even more than that, there's evidence of the cognitive biases that we all have. Right? And we know that when individuals are experiencing depression, they have some pretty clear pessimistic cognitive biases where they're more likely to interpret situations negatively. But also, if we have show people a picture of a crowd of 500 people, everybody's smiling, one person's frowning. If you're depressed, you're going to find that frowning person faster than if you're not depressed. Right? So you are trained to pick out these kind of particular stimuli, have these cognitive biases when experiencing these pathologies. So is it chicken or the egg, right? Does the cognitive bias lead to the depression, or does the depression lead to the bias? Unclear. Maybe both. But again, something that's happening probably at an unconscious level. Like you don't know that you're looking for these negative things, but it's happening. A little back more with the kind of the Freudian idea. We'll talk at times about dissociation, right? Where people have things like dissociative amnesia, where they don't remember doing things. They'll go to their closet and I didn't buy those clothes. You did. You just don't remember it because you had dissociated. Typically, and we're talking about dissociation, we're talking about the association between all your aspects of consciousness, awareness, short-term, long-term memory, all these things usually integrated. You can kind of pull it together and you know who you are, what's going on, where you've been. But when you have dissociation, those things break apart, usually briefly, and they don't fit back together. And so you end up with these like gaps in awareness and memory. And then going back even more Freudian would be this idea of repressed memories. This is a little more controversial, right? Because we know from cognitive science that memory is constructive in nature, right? You don't, well, most of you don't remember most things perfectly, right? You remember bits and pieces, and then you put back together the rest of the memory based on your expectations, your experiences, the schema you've built over time. And most of us aren't really fully aware of how imperfect our memories are. It's like, I remember, oh yeah, I remember that vacation very clearly. Maybe, probably not. You're probably filling in some gaps. And you might be right, you might be wrong, but we do know that it is very constructivist in nature. So are there some memories, though, that some part of your mind is pushing down and keeping you from remembering? Probably not in the way that Freud talked about it. But all the research on trauma do suggest that when you're experiencing something that is causing high levels of arousal, which trauma typically does, you got your limbic system firing because it's involved in lots of emotion. It's also involved in memory formation, right? Because part of the limbic system is the hippocampus, which is involved where memory consolidation. And if that system is supercharged with emotion, it's really hard to make coherent memories. And that's why people that experience traumatic events often have a hard time recalling those events, right? Not because they didn't happen or because they were unconscious, but because the part of the brain that puts memories together to be formed in the first place is kind of next to the part of the brain that's involved in fear and anxiety and anger, right? And again, it's the idea of those bare wires touching. When those things are going at the same time, one process maybe isn't going to work as well as it should. So there is certainly some evidence of disrupted memories, but not necessarily convincing evidence, I'd say, of repressed memories. Okay. Sticking with the topic of emotions, real quick, some terminology. Difference between emotions, mood, and affect. The definitions in your book, not real helpful. I don't like them. Emotions are typically time-limited, subjective experiences that are associated with cognitive inputs as well as characteristic physiological responses. Right? So that's the feeling you have, but it's the feeling with these other pieces. Right? And we'll talk about the components of emotion in a minute. That's different than mood, right? So emotion is, oh, I felt this. I had this reaction. I was feeling that, and then it stopped. Mood tends to be longer, a more enduring pattern or period of emotional experience. And it typically has either a positive or a negative valence. I was in a good mood, I was in a bad mood. Okay. And then affect is the visible expression of emotional experience, right? So if you're smiling, that's positive affect, happy affect. If you're crying, that's sad affect, right? So it's what you're showing of your emotional experience, of your mood and or emotion. So why do we have emotions and moods, and why do we show affect? Largely, I would argue that the function of emotions, they're signals, right? And from a kind of evolutionary sense, it makes sense that you would have these particular emotions, right? When you have anger, right, and the physiological component of anger being kind of increased heart rate, anger makes sense to say, hey, something is not right, something's unjust, I need to do something, I need action, right? So it makes sense. Heart rate should be up, breathing should be faster, pupils constricted, ready to, or pupils dilated, ready to go. Let's fight. That makes sense. And again, if something is sad and you're depressed, okay, well, this is not good, things are bad right now, I need to slow down. You have this kind of sapping of energy, conserve my energy until things get better. To some degree, that makes sense, right? But again, if we can kind of keep in mind that these are signals, they're not realities, right? I'm feeling anger. Okay, does that mean something may be wrong? It doesn't mean something is wrong. It doesn't mean something is unjust. It means I'm thinking something's unjust. Something might be unjust. It's a maybe, right? Because emotions aren't truth, right? They're our true experience, but we've often, at least I've often, felt things and go, oh, wait, oh, I misunderstood. Oh, my emotion no longer makes sense in this context now that I have new information, right? So yeah, it was genuine to feel that way, but it was based on bad input. So that wasn't truth, right? And if we can kind of realize that, that helps a lot of abnormal behavior, helping people realize that. So as we've already alluded to, there are different components to emotions: a cognitive component, a behavioral component, and a physiological component, right? So there's the cognitive component, which is both the input of I think this and that leads me to feel this, but also that subjective experience of, oh, I think I feel sad, I feel bad, I don't feel good, I feel really happy, everything is wonderful. These are all thoughts associated with a kind of emotional experience. The behavioral manifestation, laughing, crying, eating half a thing of a tub of ice cream, behavioral manifestations of emotions. And the physiological, so again, heart rate going up, going down, increase in perspiration, decrease in perspiration. The physiological one's interesting because we talk about there's like characteristic physiological expression of an emotion, but these physiological expressions of emotions really hard to decipher one from the other. Like if you hook somebody up to a galvanic skin response to measure this emotional response, you can't really tell which emotion they're feeling. You can often tell if they're feeling a more intense emotion or a less intense kind of, but anger and excitement, really hard to differentiate with some of these physiological measures. But all those components working together. When we talk about the pathological emotional experiences, well, what makes it abnormal behavior? What makes it pathological? Usually has to do with the intensity, right? So is it pathological to feel sad? Well, no. How sad are you feeling? Are you feeling sad enough that you're thinking about killing yourself? Okay, that may be pathological. When feeling guilty, did you do something bad? And yeah, well, you should feel bad about it. You should feel a little guilty. Now, did something tragic happen to somebody and there's nothing you have done about it, but you feel guilty anyway? Okay, that may be getting into the pathological level. If you're feeling, oh, it's all my fault, it's completely horrible. And then also after that, the appropriateness of your emotion. Does it make sense to feel this way given what happened, right? So you have inappropriate emotion, inappropriate mood, or even inappropriate affect, right? Where you're talking to somebody's telling you about some horrible, sad story, horrible loss, and they're laughing the whole time. Okay, that's inappropriate affect. That doesn't match. That may be a signal of some pathology. Something wrong is happening. Another thing is lability, which has to do with if you have a labile mood, one that's bound to change rapidly, right? In a healthy functioning individual, mood should be fairly stable, right? You may be down sometimes, happy sometimes, and if good things happen, you feel better. Bad things happen, you feel worse. But if you're rapidly cycling between emotions and highly reactive, one little thing can make you furious or sad or joyous. Very quickly, you have a very labile mood. that tends to be an indication of pathology. Okay, moving on to social influences. Looking at some fairly controversial ideas in terms of Rosenhan's study and also Thomas Zoss. And this is the idea that, well, abnormal behavior may not be a thing. Maybe it's a social construct. So Rosenhan, back in '73, had some students pretend to be psychotic, present to a psychiatric hospital and just present with some very simple symptoms. I hear thud. And so they were instructed, okay, until you get admitted, continue to say you have the symptom. As soon as you're admitted, stop pretending to have the symptom and just act normal. And he wanted to see how long it took them to get out. And it took a while for some of them. And the ones that got out, they didn't get, oh, so yeah, these people, they weren't crazy, our bad. I don't know what, they're faking whatever. No, they got out with in early remission, right? So the idea being that we create these labels of abnormal behavior and we apply them to people. And once you start applying the label, you begin to interpret all behavior you see through the lens of that label, right? So when people in this study were admitted to a facility and said, I'm not crazy, and they get out of here, oh, clients clearly in denial and becoming angry, probably increased their sedatives. Oh, it's a little scary. Thomas Zoss probably went further in his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, and said that, yeah, none of this is real. There is no such thing as psychopathology. So they're simply problems of living and society's inability to deal with it and wanting to marginalize and put people aside. Which, again, some truth, some of the ideas, but they are definitely, Zoss is definitely on the extreme end of things. There are some culture-bound syndromes, right? And you can read about different ones in the DSM. Okay, in this place, they believe they have this idea that you may be having these experiences of anxiety and insomnia and whatnot because somebody's put a hex on you, right? And it's important to know that, okay, well, there's this pathology that's specific to this group of people, and they have this shared understanding of pathology where, oh yeah, well, you just need to see a curandero and you'll be fine, or go see a shaman and you'll get it taken care of, and that's that. And they go see them and they are fine, right? So they didn't need drugs, they didn't need surgery, they didn't need therapy, they needed their culturally appropriate response. One thing to keep in mind though when we talk about these culture-bound syndromes is we have tendencies, I have a tendency to think of that as they have culture-bound syndromes, these other cultures. But we have the actual disorders, the actual pathology. No, all of our disorders are culture-bound. Every single one of them, they're Western culture-bound. Some are incredibly Western culture-bound, right? You look at anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. There's some countries that would just be unheard of. They would laugh like, what, you don't eat? You have plenty of food, but you purposely don't eat. I don't get it. Like, those things don't exist in some cultures, right? That is, to some degree, a product of our cultural values and norms and the media inputs we have, all these things. Internet addiction, right? That's something that's gaining attention here in the States and also in some Asian countries. Other places, like, again, that's how could you be addicted to being on a computer? This makes no sense. And even some of the kind of spiritual stuff we see in other cultures. Oh, aren't they so backwards and silly? Are they, though? Because think about, I know I have, I don't know if you have the same experience as me with this, but have you ever known people that if somebody is acting abnormally, maybe in a negative way, not treating their spouse correctly or not treating someone else correctly, they may say, oh yeah, the devil's got them. Oh, there's evil in them. Like, these are things that highly educated people in our culture still say. That's still a component, right? So when we talk about that supernatural model of abnormal behavior being something in the past, again, kind of remind you, it's not fully in the past. That's still here today, and it's part of our culture and different cultures to different degrees, how they look at abnormal behavior and how they look at the causes of abnormal behavior. Another influence to think about would be relationships, right? Also, gender, prejudice, and poverty. Those are certainly influences. because they can contribute to psychopathology. If you're constantly being exposed to prejudice, so people always treating you negatively, it kind of goes back to that relationship idea. Those are negative relational experiences. That is stressful, and stress over time is cumulative and can cause brain damage, right? Can cause heart damage. It's bad for you. It's bad for you to be stressed. So that can increase rates of psychopathology because it's a negative interpersonal experience. Poverty, being poor doesn't make you crazy, but it does put you at risk for psychopathology, largely because of the other things associated with poverty in terms of being impoverished often means having less access to health care. It means often means living in neighborhoods with higher crime rates and less access to education, and all these things then later increase risks or different types of psychopathology. Last thing on this one, societal values. What's important in a society matters in terms of what kind of behavior is going to develop abnormally, right? If amassing wealth is important versus if relating to other people is important, or achieving things is important. How much pressure people are put on to fit into certain societal roles, that's going to influence the number of people that are exhibiting psychopathology, right? If you're living in a very kind of happy-go-lucky, easygoing society, you can imagine you're going to see less anxiety than one that tends to be more driven towards achieve or fail, right? Okay, as I said, we'd circle back to developmental influences. Hopefully you've all at some point been exposed to Freud's psychosexual stages, which again, a lot of Freud's ideas don't hold much water anymore, but it is important to think about early experiences do matter, right? And the things that are important to you as a person when you're a baby, a toddler, a school-age child, an adolescent are different, right? And there are different kind of things that you're facing. So those ideas are important. And the degree to which you can successfully resolve crises, issues at those different stages, probably plays into the development of normal or abnormal behavior later in life. Also, Erikson's stage model, I think, is also super helpful. Obviously goes on beyond Freud's into older adulthood, which is nice. And again, the idea of these different crises you may be associated with or presented with, and the degree to which you can successfully resolve them will influence how well adapted you are. Also, don't forget Piaget's cognitive model of development, right? There's some things that are important with that in terms of abnormal behavior, in terms of the development of that's a brain fart. Abstract, abstract reasoning. But as we've said before, when thinking about these developmental influences, moving through these stages help one thinking about generalities, but they're not specific. Okay, this stage, then this stage, then this stage, and if it's pass fail. If you don't pass this one, well, you're not going forward, or you're going to be permanently damaged. Development, normal development and pathological development is all about trajectories, right? So there is generally thought to be some sort of corridor of a normal developmental trajectory where you become more autonomous, more open to experience, more relating to people, whatever it is. And people can be above or below that corridor. If you're in the corridor, okay, that's typical, that's normal. Now, your trajectory can change, and you can go up or down on any one of these kind of traits or behaviors. But it's important to remember that when that trajectory changes, and that change could be because, again, of some influence of a change in a relationship or some sort of biological thing that happened, whatever, it's not one change and done. Okay, well, I changed trajectory, now I'm going this way. Well, you're going that way now. The trajectory can change again. It can go back towards normality. Or if you're doing fine, hey, don't relax. Could be not fine. Development is an ongoing process. In terms of ongoing, we often forget about, we ignore the ongoing at the end, right? So I just want to remind you all that about the most commonly ignored group in our psychology classes, older adults. And super important in terms of a lot of psychopathology. There are issues that, if we're all lucky to live into older adulthood, will face in terms of end-of-life challenges, existential crises about, okay, what's the meaning of my life as I come closer to death, that need to be resolved successfully to be healthy, have healthy psychological functioning. And we talk about things like depression and suicide. One of the highest risk groups for suicide, older white men who've lost their job. That's a huge red flag for, okay, be ready for, do a good suicide assessment, right? So these are individuals that we should be keeping in mind as we're thinking about these different trajectories of abnormal behavior over time. Don't just assume, oh, if you've lived older adulthood, you're fine, you made it through the woods. There's some truth to that, but there are also some unique challenges that group may face. Okay, wrapping it up. Take-home message. Abnormal behavior is multiply determined, right? And when it's multiply determined, it's not in a way that's simply additive. Okay, you have this anxiety. Well, 10% is because of this, 20% is this, 30% is this, right? You're not just adding these pieces. It's integrative. It's interacting, right? So biological, psychological, social, cultural, all these things are interacting, and they're interacting over time in this kind of developmental framework, right? Super complex framework. And it's kind of trying to show here, it's cyclical. So the biological affects the psychosocial, which affects the biological, which affects the psychosocial, right? And we know that it's easy to see a lot of times that, oh, the biological affects the psychosocial, right? We can say, okay, you damage this part of the brain, now you're acting differently. But we also have shown if you change the environment, if we put you in therapy, it changes the way your brain works. It changes the way your brain is structured. We can see structural changes in the brain related to environmental exposures, right? So it is no doubt reciprocal, right? But because it's reciprocal, it's so complex. One of the things that means is the cause of abnormal behavior is likely unique to the individual, right? So there's hundreds of millions of different ways for people to get to some sort of psychopathology. It's like, oh, you have anorexia, oh, you must both have this. Maybe, maybe not. They could have very different experiences. And they might have one or two things in common, but they probably don't have everything in common that led them to the point of refusing to maintain a minimally normal body weight, right? So there's some uniqueness to this. But the question we've been asking here, what causes abnormal behavior? What causes psychopathology? Might that not even be the right question? Because maybe we ought to take a step back, again, holistic approach, and maybe a better question is, what causes normal behavior? And what do we mean by normal behavior? We say, okay, yeah, you want to have friends and be in a romantic relationship. Why? What made that happen? What part of the brain did that? You know, what part of the brain makes you comfortable speaking in public? What part of the brain makes you eat a healthy amount of food and no more and no less? Right? If we can start thinking about those questions, thinking about it that way, that may shed some light on the other questions about what causes abnormal behavior. And again, may open up some new avenues. So, something to think about. Again, overall take-home messages, super complicated. It's multiply determined, and the cause for an individual is probably a series of causes over time that's unique to them, and it's not done yet. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.